Hey, everybody. Well, today is a momentous day. I have been contacted by a number of people who have come out of the woodwork thanks to the film about the cryptoid creatures and generally my research and Richard Thompson's research into Rendlesham Forest incident. The people who have come out of the woodwork now want to confirm what was really going on in the 1980s in the military sector in the UK with the US Air Force. And I think I now have a much better picture of what might have been going on at the Bentwaters Woodbridge bases. And the first clue really came from Laurie Reifelt. She told the story how she'd been to England, as she calls it, as a child, and was very happy to return via Mildenhall for her service in the Bentwaters Woodbridge base as a security officer in the late 70s. And she arrived at Mildenhall, got on the bus and went to Bentwaters, where she found it horrible. The overriding feeling that she got inside her, she's a sensitive person, no doubt, was of horror and dread. She found lawlessness, alcoholism, drug abuse, self-harming, a high suicide rate, and an uncanny number of people who were desperate to get out of the Air Force and get away from the base. I mean, that's an overview. Obviously, they were operational and were carrying on doing their NATO Cold War duties very effectively. But she felt, along with a number of other people, that there was an overall angst at the base. And she shared the story of her friend Barry, who went to RAF Feltwell, where he felt exactly the same. And strangely, both Barry and Laurie, later on, after they'd been in their East Anglia bases for a short time, started seeing things. They started seeing cryptoid creatures and lights in the sky. And there was a general feeling that there was something strange going on in Suffolk. Now, I've always put it down to Suffolk, that probably there's a thin veil in the eastern counties. There's obviously a history of things like Sutton Hoo, and lots of locals have told stories of time dilation and seeing strange things in that area, including creatures. And Colonel Holt talks about how there was a coven, which is important in British witchcraft, that was in that area. So maybe there is something strange about the area. But then I got contacted by somebody who pointed me in a very interesting direction. He said, had I ever looked into the DeCaro film made for CNN back in the 1980s about how the Soviet Union and then the US were looking at brain manipulation. So it turns out that the Soviet Union were very interested in affecting people's brains by external mechanisms. If only they could send a signal to a person at a distance that would alter their perception or what they were doing. This was experimented heavily in the USSR on probably humans and definitely on animals. And eventually they came up with a very interesting system, which we know as Duga or the woodpecker. And the woodpecker is a giant RF EM frequency transmitter, ironically linked to Chernobyl, which sends out this bing, bing, bing pulse directed at the West, at the UK and the United States. And very cleverly, this person tells me, has a frequency which is amplified by the electromagnetic, by our power grid. So it's in frequency with, I think, the American power grid specifically at 60 hertz. So it's sympathetically amplified when it reaches the United States and sends out this low-frequency, continuous woodpecker sound. And the USA were very concerned about Duga. The USSR said it was an over-the-horizon radar, which is ironic, and we'll go on to talk about Cobra Mist, which also was supposedly an OTH system. But it turns out that the woodpecker might well have been an early and very powerful way of trying to affect a foreign nation by sending electromagnetic pulses across the ocean to affect a nation. Right. Hold that thought, because I'm going to come back to it. And I'm going to come back to how the USA and the UK probably experimented with a sister project at Cobra Mist. But that's a big story. But let's first of all confirm to you, skeptical viewers, good, that the USSR at the time wanted to affect foreign policy of other nations by undermining society. There's two stories that I have never told publicly that I actually want to make into a drama because they're so good. One about a punk band and one about apartheid. And I'm just going to tell you it as a news and current affairs story today, and it still would make a really good drama. So I was very much a punk. I was involved in the music scene in the 80s, and I know a very famous, not to be named, 1980s punk rock band who were okay, and they, struggled to get funding for recording contracts and hire a transit van and a PA when they went, but they had a Russian roadie who openly admitted that he worked and was funded by the KGB. And anytime this band, who are very well known, by the way, wanted to have a bit of funds to record something or hire a van or equipment or whatever, the roadie would mysteriously come up with a check and support this punk rock band. Now, the band in question were very much anti-establishment in a good way, in my opinion, and they wanted to question British normality authority in a way. They were kind of having songs about against banking and against capitalism, and that was their idea. So this roadie was a KGB person who was funded to help a punk rock band potentially, just in a tiny way, undermine British society by changing things. Now, it's well known that Malcolm McLaren, who was the organizer of the Sex Pistols, was KGB funded. That's all public now. And records such as God Save the Queen, a Fascist Regime by the Pistols was very much a KGB funded effort to undermine, in that case, Queen Elizabeth, who, of course, it was on a pinnacle of normality. I mean, she really held Britain together when Britain was going through the changes of the 60s and the terrible 70s and the disruptive 80s. Queen Elizabeth was that kind of tweed-dressed normality that British people held on to. And so undermining Queen Elizabeth was a massively clever technique by the KGB to undermine British society. And they did that by funding Malcolm McLaren to run the Sex Pistols. In the same way, this roadie helped my friend's band have a similar effect by releasing songs that were against normality of normal capitalism in Britain. And so that was a policy that the KGB did. Now, the other story is fantastic. I have a very good friend who's a wonderful artist, sadly deceased, who I knew at Kingston Art College, whose father was South African and ran the anti-apartheid sports movement. So he stopped foreign sports teams coming to South Africa during the apartheid regime to highlight the terrible apartheid thing that was going on in South Africa at the time in the rugby field. So rugby World Cup was cancelled by this guy, Chris. And he was very up in the anti-apartheid movement. But it turns out that the anti-apartheid movement, and he was funded by the KGB, that all emerged. And he was expelled from South Africa And of course, eventually anti-apartheid movement prevailed, and we now have a return of South Africans running their own country. So Chris and his family moved to England. He decided that London would be a great supporter of what he did, but when he arrived in London and stayed in a West London hotel, he was contacted and told that he wasn't welcome in Britain, that his KGB connections with the anti-apartheid movement overruled his good work that he'd done in anti-apartheid. And so Chris never really became accepted or needed or wanted or respected in British society. He had his family here and they still live here, but eventually Chris moved to live in France, where he sadly deceased, and is a great star and a hero of mine for being an anti-apartheid sports person who changed the world. But another case where the KGB paid money to somebody to undermine society. So the KGB likes to mess around with people's ideas, their brains, their ways of thinking. Imagine an even more effective technique would be if you could send an electromagnetic pulse signal, and they knew this kind of work from experiments on animals that would change people's point of view and ideas from the Soviet Union. So you could beam out, and people in Britain would go, or in the United States. So we think that they experimented with this, and the USA were deeply concerned that this was going on. Of course, you're all screaming Havana syndrome, and that's exactly what we've discovered in the Havana syndrome, where today Russians are using EM frequencies to beam into American embassies to affect the staff inside the embassy. And it's been proven because people have been arrested in cars with devices outside embassies with strange EM propagating devices that affects people's brains. Havana syndrome actually does work, and it's a serious way of messing around with people inside the building. So was there a system in place in the 1980s that the Soviet Union was beaming into England, Britain, and into the United States? Yes. And was the United States interested in doing it themselves? Yes. So I was contacted today by somebody who told me about a project which was euphemistically called the brain bomb. All right. And the brain bomb was a US system to look at whether the US, could build an electromagnetic pulse device that could affect people. Ideally, I mean, this is pretty outlandish, it might kill people. If not, it might blur their vision or make soldiers incapacitated. If you could beam a signal to an invading army from Suffolk, if you get my drift. So strangely, Cobra Mist, although it was classified like Duga as an OTH radar, might also have been a brain bomb experimental device to see if it could send the equivalent of the Russian woodpecker signal back out to Eastern Europe that would either blur the vision or affect badly an invading Soviet army if they ever invaded Western Europe, as well as causing EMP effects. And I think that as the experimental station in Suffolk, that was maybe what I'm now hearing that they were involved with. And so was potentially Martlesham Heath looking at high-powered microwaves, maybe. So it gets much darker, folks. It gets very dark. And this is a bit speculative, and not everybody agrees with me on this, but I'm being pointed in the direction, and I think Laurie Reifeld's evidence of Bentwaters being a dark, dangerous, unpleasant, disrupted place with people acting oddly, and then sightings, and then lights in the sky, and then eventually leading to the Rendlesham Forest incident, where lights were seen, maybe creatures were seen, and people were injured, might have been an intentional or unintentional side effect of the brain bomb experiments going on in Suffolk. Question: was Bentwaters Woodbridge a unknowing experiment zone that was using US Air Force service personnel going on with their normal everyday Cold War NATO duties, but all the time being affected by something either intentionally or unintentionally locally, which was aimed at the Soviet Union, either as a technique or intentionally to see how Allied service people would be affected by these kind of frequencies. That would mean the US Air Force probably didn't know about it. But of course, it's far-fetched because you would think, well, why would you affect your own personnel? Well, to test the system. And certainly we know that in the Rendlesham Forest incident, there was a very high-powered non-US Air Force team came in to assess the psychological profiles of the personnel who were affected by the incident. Maybe they were always there. I also know that Cobra Mist had a biological workstation looking at plants. Maybe they were also looking at human brains. I really don't know. So is it possible that Martlesham, possibly a base at Woodbridge, and Cobra Mist or Orford Ness, powered of course by Sizewell, was actually a brain bomb experiment? Putting it like this, I was contacted today from somebody on the far side of the planet who wanted to point me in that direction. I have no idea. I mean, obviously it's highly classified and secret, but it would certainly add up to why Laurie Reinfeldt felt so upset and felt like there was a terrible feeling in the Rendlesham area. Does the effect still linger? Is it still there? Did it unleash something from the NHI world, which also resonated to the brain bomb frequencies and emerged out of the dimensional interface with humanity and now appears regularly in the sky as UAP or as cryptoid creatures? It's a fascinating field of research. And I think I've more than scratched the surface because I've obviously got the attention now of a number of people who know what they're talking about, including, how can I put this, military researchers and people working in the defense industry today who write to me and say things like, you're on the right track, keep going, and look at this. And I feel like there's people out there who do know what really happened. And suddenly I'm beginning to see a clearer picture of why people like John Burroughs were injured. Maybe their injury was intentional or horrible accident caused by something that was originally humanly evoked. I don't know. But I feel that if you keep watching where I'm going with this, I'm either going to disappear, I hope not, or Wallace, my goat, will protect me, I'm sure, but or actually come with a massive reveal of this is really what was going on in Suffolk and is still going on in Suffolk today. So I like bringing these stories to you. It's very important to me. What I'm going to say now is very odd. Stand by. Something that you need to know about me. I think a lot of people have a misconception. My channel's called Professor Simon, when I'm not really a PhD professor. I did teach at a university and to graduate students, so I feel like I worked in the university system, and I'm obviously an honors graduate student myself. But what I'm going to say right now is very different from what I normally say on these programs. As you heard in the film I did yesterday, YouTube is messing around and there's now no longer any income to actually fund these films. So I'm really looking for somebody to support me and to actually be a sponsor. If you think that I'm politically aligned with you or I'm going in the right direction, I need funding to actually travel abroad, do better research, have better archive, employ people, because I'm good at editing. I'm less good at graphics, which my channel desperately needs, animation to illustrate some of these points. I recently have had to stop working with a thumbnail designer because I can't afford to pay for him. I'd like to have better music and composers if you want that, maybe. And just generally to up the channel to a new level where I can actually start paying guests and, as I say, travel and meet people. So if you're interested in reaching out anonymously, if you think what I'm doing is worthwhile, get in touch at Simonhollandfilms@gmail.com. There's an address on my YouTube homepage. So here's my CV. So I went to Sheffield University where I studied filmmaking with some of the best documentary filmmakers, Barry Callahan, Paul Haywood. And they worked with people like Barry Hines, who made Kess, and we learned the skill of documentary filmmaking. The 5 people I went to college with, all of us still are broadcast filmmakers. It really rubbed off. We learned our craft. I left Sheffield University with a degree on Friday and joined the BBC Ealing Film Studios the following Monday. They snapped me up as a film editor. And I was very, very privileged to work on films like John le Carrier's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Doctor Who, The World About Us, Tomorrow's World for years. And then when something called ENG, Electronic News Gathering, came out in the 80s, I was keen on technology, so I volunteered to become a video editor, and I worked for a program called Panorama. If you're British, you know about it, during the 80s. That was the time of Thatcher, of the miners' strike, of the troubles in Northern Ireland, of lots of things going on in the world. And we were very critical of the Thatcher regime, and then we were very critical of the Blair regime. So it was the BBC at its best. I think it's become undermined today. I think it shot itself in the foot by trying to be too much to too many people. But at the time, we certainly rocked the boat on both sides of the political party. And I learned a lot working in BBC News and Current Affairs. And to this day, I have many contacts, including political leaders who work there and have gone on to the great and the good of Britain. I worked in a number of programs for Panorama that were about engineering and technology and science, and I really enjoyed them. And so I transited from News and Current Affairs into working for another important BBC program called Horizon. They made 5 50-minute documentaries a year, and I was very lucky to join Horizon when they had a new program editor who changed the direction. Horizon got sub 1 million viewers. It was rather didactic lecturing. And she wanted to make Horizon much more populist and more like the Discovery Channel. And we did amazing work. We introduced Hollywood music, graphics, and we did programs such as Mega Tsunami, and probably the biggest program I worked on was Yellowstone Supervolcano, and things like that. We became rather populist, and we also did a amazing co-production with a way of telling documentary stories using an act structure, the Robert McKee structure. So dramas use acts, opening, middle, and closing acts. Documentaries didn't. They were tended to be lists or just a rambling narrative. And when Robert McKee and Horizon worked together, we came up with this act structure where Act 1 would be, we found something totally mysterious, we don't know what it is, and we can't solve it, but it's a major problem. Act 2 is we look here, there, and everywhere, and nothing we do can affect the problem, but maybe there's a tiny clue, and Act 3 is the tiny clue ends up into being the solution to the problem. And that act structure we imposed on science programs in a way that made films very accessible and very interesting as storytelling. Horizon then changed into what it is today, if it still exists, into very much observational documentaries following the work of scientists. And they dropped me because I was seen as the sensationalist editor, the one who used music. Sadly, that was my fault, in science documentaries. And so I then started working for PBS, WGBH, the National Geographic Channel, and Discovery Channel. And one of the big Discovery Channel films I worked on was a NASA series called When We Left Earth, and things like that, loads of stuff. And for PBS, I worked on Origins, which was a WGBH series about the origin of the universe, looking at the cosmic microwave background with this young presenter called Neil deGrasse Tyson. So that's me. And when I retired, as I have, and now live in France, in this farmette in southwest France, I decided that a lot of the films that I worked on ignored the truth, and that TV and media had its day. And I wanted to do films in my own way. For example, the NASA film, When We Left Earth, totally ignored the real role of the shuttle. And they didn't talk about STS and the military use and spy satellite launching. And so that was something I knew about that the program had ignored, and I wanted to put right. If you notice on my banner on my YouTube channel, it says, tells the stories that TV won't tell you. And I still want to do that, and that's my aim. So that's who I am. I'm a broadcast professional who likes to tell revisionist history, who likes to tell the truth and dive into things which might be not popular with the military or government. So if you want to support me, and sponsor me, I'm happy to work with you as a producer behind the scenes if you think I'm going in the right direction. This channel needs a supporter. I see people like Jesse Michael have various people behind them paying for their studio time and travel and things. I feel like my professional job and skill level in broadcast television needs to be brought to the next level, and not just be talking to you in my basement here in France and have no money. For example, I really wanted to go to the Seoul conference, but it's going to cost me $1,000 to fly there and put myself up in a hotel. And, that's the kind of thing that you would really like, and actually go to Sweden and meet Beatrice Villarroel and people like that. I'm happy to travel and meet these people for you, but to do that, I can't do it on the tuppence that YouTube pay me at present. So if you are in any way interested in becoming a behind the scenes or public sponsor who want to work with me as an executive producer and actually help bring this channel to a new level, get in touch at Simonhollandfilms@gmail.com. So thank you very much. For the rest of you who just enjoy my content, and hopefully you've learned something new about Rendlesham today, as the brain bomb idea, just keep watching. You can be a patron if you want, or if you just watch on YouTube, share films and links on social media really helps, or just keep on being loyal viewers. I very much appreciate it. But if you want to get more directly involved, get in touch. Because I think the truth really needs to be out there.